I once thought the worst thing was being kicked out by my own son right after my husband's funeral, but no. The worst was when he came back, begged for forgiveness, then secretly tried to sell the very recipes I wrote with tears and blood. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch every episode that will leave you speechless. It was snowing again in Denver. Outside, the wind howled across the slate rooftops and bare maple trees, scattering the last stubborn leaves across the sidewalk like crumpled letters never sent. Inside the small brick house on Sycamore Lane, the kitchen glowed like an ember, dim but warm, its walls lined with copper pots, faded cookbooks, and the lingering scent of cinnamon and orange peel. Joanna Myers stood in front of the old gas oven, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. The light above her flickered softly. She could still hear the ghost of her husband's voice in this kitchen, the laughter echoing from 35 years of Thanksgivings, his quiet hum while washing dishes, his boots thudding on the hardwood floor after long shifts as a postal clerk. But now it was just her and the ticking wall clock, her and the ache in her knees, her and the heavy silence between the walls. She pulled a tray of raisin scones from the oven, their buttery scent lifting gently into the air. As she placed them on the rack to cool, she glanced over at the tin box on the shelf, dented, weather-worn, and sealed with a rubber band. Her recipes, dozens of them, some written in neat script, others with oil-stained corners and crusted flour. The box was more than recipes. It was memory, legacy, survival. The timer beeped. She turned it off, then stood still. It had been 7 months since Paul died. 7 months since the funeral. 7 months of navigating widowhood, one slow, uneven breath at a time. Joanna moved through her home like a person searching for something she'd misplaced, the rhythm of her days, the voice to say something out loud to. Neighbors waved, friends called, church folks offered help, but none of it pierced the dullness in her bones. And then that morning Daniel called, her only son. "Mom," he said over the phone, "Marla and I were talking, and we think maybe you shouldn't be alone in Denver anymore." She had smiled at his concern. "That's sweet of you, Daniel. I'm managing. The house keeps me busy." "But Mom," he pressed gently, "you shouldn't have to manage. You should be resting, healing. We've got the space. Haven Hills, peaceful quiet. There's a garden, fresh air, no city traffic. Marla makes smoothies now with kale. You'd love it." Joanna had chuckled at that, picturing her daughter-in-law's Instagram-worthy breakfast bowls. Still, something in his voice made her pause. A mix of invitation and insistence. Familiar. Daniel had always been persuasive. Even as a child, that boy could talk a raccoon into giving up its sandwich. He said all the right things. That they'd rearrange the guest room, that Marla was excited, that their 2 kids, her grandbabies, missed her and wanted her close. And then, just as she was softening, he said it. "There's something else, Mom, about the house in Denver." Her spine straightened as she sat at the kitchen table. "What about it?" "Well, it's just sitting there. You don't need all that space anymore. And frankly, you've got equity in it that could be doing more for you, for all of us." She didn't respond. "I've looked into a trust arrangement." He continued, his tone smooth. "We could transfer the deed into our names. That way I can help manage things from here, streamline taxes. You'd still live with us, of course. We'd take care of everything. All we need is your signature to make it official." She stared at the black phone in her hand. It felt heavier than before. "I'll think about it," she said. But she already knew. Daniel was the boy she'd raised through 2 jobs and a broken ankle. She'd sat through every parent-teacher conference, cooked every science fair volcano, kissed every fevered forehead. Surely she could trust him, couldn't she? That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the dining room, the contract Daniel had emailed spread before her. Legal terms swam in front of her eyes. It was a simple deed transfer, he'd said. Just names, just paperwork. She reached for a pen, then paused. Joanna stood crossed the room and pulled the tin box from the kitchen shelf. She opened it, running her fingers over the recipes inside. Tucked between layers of parchment was one in Paul's handwriting, a scribbled note from years ago. "Never let anything take your flavor, Joe, not even the world. She exhaled, then signed her name anyway. 3 weeks later, a moving truck pulled into her driveway. Daniel arrived the next morning full of energy, his arms wide as he stepped through the front door. "Mom, you're going to love it." Marla followed behind, wearing large sunglasses and a fitted cream sweater, barely making eye contact. The packing was quick. Too quick. Daniel moved room by room like a realtor on a deadline, boxing Joanna's things with efficiency that felt eerily practiced. "I'll drive the SUV," he said as they loaded the last bag. Joanna clutched her tin box close, keeping it in her lap the entire 6-hour drive to Haven Hill. It was a sleepy town nestled between pines and hills where mailboxes leaned, and the gas station still had wind chimes on its porch. The house Daniel and Marla lived in was a beige 2-story near the end of a cul-de-sac with a gravel driveway and a neat lawn that smelled of mulch. Inside, everything was clean. Cold. Joanna stepped into the guest room, small, tidy, a view of a fence. No garden, no bookshelves, no warmth. But Daniel smiled like everything was perfect. "You'll see, Mom," he said. "This is the beginning of your new chapter." That night she lay on the unfamiliar mattress, listening to the distant hum of the fridge. Her fingers rested on the tin box, now tucked beneath her pillow. She missed the creak of her floorboards, the clicking radiators, the clatter of the Denver bus outside her window. But this was family. This was where she was supposed to be, wasn't it? The next morning, Marla made green smoothies and handed Joanna one with a tight smile. "It's packed with nutrients," she said. "Chia flax kale and a touch of spirulina." Joanna forced a sip, the bitterness clawing at her throat. Over the next few days, the house settled into a rhythm that didn't include her. The grandkids were polite but distracted. Daniel was busy with calls. Marla disappeared behind closed doors with a yoga mat. Joanna tried cooking, but the kitchen felt foreign, sterile. Her hands itched for flour, for dough, for something real. One afternoon, she asked Daniel if she could plant some herbs near the kitchen window. He laughed. "Oh, Mom, that's not really necessary. We do grocery delivery now." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. That night, she stood outside on the back porch, staring into the dark pine trees, the cold air nipping at her cheeks. In her hand was the old tin box. In her chest, something shifted, not yet broken, but beginning to crack. The days in Haven Hill began with fog and ended with silence. At first, Joanna tried to adjust. She woke early to the sound of birds she couldn't name, brewed weak coffee in a kitchen that didn't belong to her, and folded blankets that weren't hers to wash. She smiled through awkward breakfasts and forced herself to say thank you when Marla handed her lukewarm smoothies in tall glass tumblers with paper straws. Every act felt like a performance, the applause always delayed if it came at all. Daniel was kind enough the first week. He brought her a space heater when the guest room got cold. He printed out her pill schedule and stuck it to the refrigerator with a pineapple-shaped magnet. He even downloaded a puzzle app on her phone. "Try to stay sharp, Mom," he said one afternoon, tapping the screen. "Mental stimulation is crucial at your age." At your age. That phrase wrapped around her like a noose. Joanna kept quiet. She didn't want to be ungrateful. She'd taught herself not to be. But there was a humming under her skin, low and persistent, like something inside her knew this wasn't what it seemed. Still, she wanted to believe this was just transition, that the discomfort would pass, that Daniel, her only son, was doing his best. But slowly things began to shift. Small things at first. Her baking tins never made it out of the moving boxes. She asked once, twice. Marla said they were in storage for now. The spice rack she brought, the one Paul had built by hand, vanished. The little blanket from her Denver armchair was found folded in the garage, dusty and forgotten. Joanna's voice was soft by nature, but here it disappeared altogether. Meals became colder, conversations shorter. The kids stopped knocking on her door at night. And Daniel, he was always busy. Conference calls, spreadsheets, meetings. The big promotion he'd hinted at never came. Instead, he wore stress like a second skin and drank more coffee than water. One Thursday night, Joanna padded out of her room to get water. The house was dark except for the soft glow from the kitchen. As she stepped down the hallway, voices drifted through the air. She stopped. Daniel's voice, sharp, whispering. "She doesn't even do anything all day. Just sits there staring at the backyard like it's going to change." Marla answered, her tone clipped. "What did you expect? She's 70, Daniel. She's not going to suddenly become a podcast host. A pause. Then Daniel again. We've got to move this along. We can't keep supporting her. The Denver house funds are almost gone. And you know the nursing home downtown gave us an estimate. Marla sighed. What are you waiting for? Call them. She won't fight back. She can't even figure out how to turn on the Roku. There was laughter, brief, ugly. Daniel's voice dropped lower. We get her in by next week, finalize everything, and then we breathe again. Okay. Joanna stood frozen, her back pressed against the hallway wall, the cold from the tile floor seeping into her bones. Her water glass trembled in her hand. She had misheard. She had to have. She waited for something redeeming, a joke, a twist, a confession that it was all a misunderstanding. But silence returned, followed by the closing of the fridge and the low sound of Marla yawning. Joanna slipped back into her room like a shadow. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning at breakfast, Daniel acted normal. He asked if she wanted almond milk or oat milk for her cereal. He joked about one of the kids losing a tooth. Marla read a blog post aloud about cognitive decline in older women and how daily walks might help. They both smiled at her like painted mannequins. Joanna stared into her bowl of bran flakes and felt the edges of her world turn white-hot with betrayal. Later that day, she tried to confront him. Just the two of them. Daniel was outside trimming hedges, wearing earbuds and humming something tuneless. She stepped out onto the porch. Daniel, can we talk? He looked up, pulling one earbud out. Yeah, what's up? Joanna hesitated, then pushed the words through. I overheard you and Marla last night about the nursing home. He blinked, once, twice. Then he exhaled like she'd caught him forgetting to pay a bill. Mom, you said you were going to move me out next week. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he picked at a leaf stuck to his glove. It's not like that. Then what's it like, Daniel? Explain it to me. A pause. Then his voice hardened. You're not making this easy. I didn't realize I was supposed to. He dropped the clippers onto the grass. You're 70, Mom. You have no income. You signed over the house. We're raising 2 kids trying to build a future, and frankly, he stopped himself. You're not independent anymore. Joanna stepped back like she'd been slapped. So you're throwing me away? He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. No one's throwing you away. It's a facility. A nice one. Medical care. Staff. Bingo nights. You'll be fine. I gave you everything I had, she said, her voice low. Daniel scoffed. Yeah, and we've been giving everything we've got just to stay afloat. I can't keep bleeding for you. I need to think about my family. She stared at him. I am your family. But he had already turned away. The sky cracked open that evening. Rain fell in sheets, slanting sideways, driven by wind that bent the trees and rattled the shutters. The power flickered once, then returned. In the kitchen, Marla sipped tea in silence. Daniel was upstairs on a call. The kids were asleep. Joanna sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. The room smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. Her suitcase was under the bed, half unpacked. Her good coat hung on a hook, and the tin box, her recipes, her history rested quietly on the nightstand untouched. She opened it with steady hands. One by one she flipped through the cards. Lemon thyme scones, buttermilk biscuits, her grandmother's honey pie, Paul's favorite carrot cake, her own invention maple rosemary shortbread. Each card was a chapter, each stain a scar of joy. Then she pulled out the bottom layer beneath it, a folded map. Denver to Haven Hill, a route Paul had once drawn for a fall camping trip. She unfolded it, smoothed it on the bedspread, and studied it in the dim light. Her decision hardened like cooling caramel. She rose, moved like a woman escaping war. She packed what she could into a canvas tote, a flashlight, a cardigan, the tin box, her wallet, a pair of gardening gloves. She folded the blanket from Denver and tucked it inside. Her heart thudded like it was trying to outrun her ribs. In the garage, the old bicycle leaned against the wall, dusty tires soft, but the chain still intact. Daniel used it once to train for a 5K he never ran. Joanna wheeled it into the driveway, eyes flicking to the house. No movement. The rain covered everything, her scent, her steps, her shame. She climbed on. Her knees screamed, her hands trembled. But the wind met her like an old friend, and the darkness wrapped around her like the apron she used to wear. She pedaled through the cul-de-sac, past sleeping houses, past neatly trimmed hedges, past every part of the life she thought she still belonged to. The wheels wobbled at first, but she pushed harder, into the mist, into the storm, into whatever came next. Haven Hill faded behind her. No headlights followed. No voices called her name. Just the road, the pounding rain, and the fire in her chest that refused to go out. She was 70 years old, and she had just run away from home. The road was narrow and rising. Joanna pedaled slowly, the breath in her lungs turning to steam in the cold air. Her coat was soaked through. Mud sprayed up her calves. Pine trees crowded the roadside like sentinels, their wet branches hissing with wind. Somewhere behind her, Haven Hill still slept. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe Daniel had already opened the garage and noticed the empty space where the bike had been. Maybe Marla was calling the police, playing the concerned daughter-in-law. It didn't matter now. The old mountain road twisted sharply, and Joanna leaned forward, her fingers gripping the handlebars. She could feel every bump through the soles of her damp sneakers. Her legs ached, her back screamed, but she didn't stop. Not for the hills, not for the rain, not even for her fear. At the top of the ridge, she finally paused. She got off the bike and stood with both feet planted on gravel, breathing hard. The valley stretched out below, dark and wet and endless. And there, hidden between a patch of overgrown blackberry bushes and the skeletal remains of a barbed wire fence, stood the cabin. She hadn't seen it in over 20 years. The roof sagged slightly. Moss clung to the edges like a sleeping beast. One shutter hung crooked, slapping the wall in the wind, but it was still there, still waiting. Joanna walked the bike toward it, her shoes sinking into the soft earth. She reached the porch, tested the first step. It groaned, but held. Then the second. She pushed open the door and was met with the thick scent of pine dust and rusted metal. A mouse darted from the corner and vanished beneath a pile of splintered firewood. She exhaled. It wasn't much, it was hardly shelter, but it was hers. This cabin had been Paul's sanctuary. He built it with his own hands after Joanna gave birth to Daniel, carving out weekends to retreat into silence, into the quiet hum of trees and stars. She used to resent this place, thought it was his way of running from responsibility. But one summer, he brought her and Daniel up for a weekend. That was when she'd seen it differently. It wasn't an escape. It was preservation. Joanna dragged the bike inside and shut the door. The wind immediately dulled. She dropped her bag to the ground and pulled off her wet coat. Her bones shivered from the cold, but her heart had started to warm. She knelt near the hearth, tried the old iron stove, still intact. She searched the walls for the stash Paul had once kept behind a loose board to the left of the fireplace. Her fingers scraped wood until she felt the soft give of the panel. She pried it loose and found a small bundle inside a tin of waterproof matches, a can of beans, a few old photos in a plastic sleeve, and one folded flannel shirt. The fabric smelled of smoke and cedar. Her eyes welled. She got the fire started with trembling hands. The first match failed. The second caught. Soon the stove began to crackle and the cabin filled with the warm hiss of burning pine. Joanna sat on the floor beside it, hugging her knees, her wet clothes steaming in the heat. Outside, rain pounded the tin roof in sheets. Inside, the flame danced like it remembered her. After a while, she stood sore and stiff and explored. There were broken chairs, a caved-in mattress, a rusted pan on the wall, and an old metal table still bolted to the floor. In the corner beneath a tarp, she found a crate filled with Paul's forgotten tools, a small hammer, a coil of rope, a camping stove. And then behind a stack of boards, an old wooden sign carved by hand, Myers Shelter. Her throat closed. She ran her fingers across the grooves of Paul's lettering. By morning, the storm had passed, and a strange hush filled the forest. Joanna stood outside the cabin, staring at the mountains stretched before her, the valley still misted with fog. She spent the next 2 days cleaning. The floor was swept, the windows washed with rainwater and rags made from an old flannel. She aired out the blankets, patched the holes in the tarp roof with duct tape from the tool crate. When she found a dented kettle, she boiled water and scrubbed the countertop. Her muscles protested, but her heart was steady. Each day she checked her phone. No calls, no messages, 1 bar of signal, that was it. On the 3rd day she opened her tin recipe box. She spread the cards across the table like a deck of sacred prayers. They were spotted, creased, smudged with butter, and full of life. She picked 3: lavender lemon muffins, whole wheat honey bread, brown butter rosemary shortbread. She had no lavender, no honey, no butter, but she had flour, some sugar, a small packet of instant yeast, and a half bag of dried cranberries she'd shoved into her canvas bag the night she fled. It would have to do. She lit the camping stove, placed the dented pan on top, and measured by instinct. A pinch of salt, a handful of flour, water warmed on the kettle. She stirred until her arm burned, kneaded until her hands remembered the rhythm, formed a rough dough. She placed it near the fire to rise. Hours passed. When it was ready, she shaped the dough into fat rounds studded with the last of the cranberries and baked them on a small tray inside the wood stove. Smoke curled around the door, filling the cabin with a scent she hadn't smelled in weeks home. When she bit into the first roll, she cried. It was imperfect, dense, underproofed, slightly burnt, but it was hers. And it meant she hadn't disappeared. The next morning, she built a shelf beside the window and lined it with empty jars she found in the shed. She cleaned them, filled them with pebbles and pine cones, dried leaves and cinnamon sticks. She wanted beauty, even here. Especially here. By day 5, she began to think beyond herself. The mountain road below her cabin curved sharply, forcing drivers to slow down. There was a small turnout, gravel-covered, just 50 yards from the edge of her property. She stood there with a cup of coffee and watched as the occasional car passed a pickup, a delivery van, a lone cyclist. She saw the possibility. The next day, she rummaged through the storage crates until she found an old table, 2 milk crates, and a plank of plywood. With the help of Paul's hammer, she built a crude stand. She sanded the top with a scrap of steel wool, wiped it clean, and painted the front with what was left of a blue can labeled Storm Sky. Then she took the old wooden sign that had read Meyer's Shelter, flipped it over, and carved 3 words on the blank side: Butter and Wild. Below it in smaller letters, Bread's Warmth and Second Chances. She placed a wicker basket at the center of the table and filled it with the last 6 cranberry rolls, wrapping each in wax paper. She placed a jar beside them with a handwritten sign, Take what you need, leave what you can. Then she waited. It rained again that night, and again she sat by the fire listening to it drum the roof like a heartbeat. By dawn, 3 rolls were gone. Inside the jar, a $5 bill, 3 quarters, and a folded napkin that read, Best thing I've eaten in weeks. Thank you. Joanna clutched the note to her chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt something sturdy settle in her bones. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. Something that smelled of flour and smoke and fresh air. Something built with her own hands. Something the world couldn't take. She had nothing. No home. No title. No promises. But she had a name, Butter and Wild, and the fire inside her was just beginning to rise. Joanna was rolling out a rough batch of cinnamon oat dough when she heard the crunch of gravel outside. It was mid-morning, and the clouds above the ridge hung low like wool about to fray. She brushed flour off her hands, wiped them on her apron, and stepped out to the roadside stand. A dusty gray SUV had pulled into the turnout. The driver's door creaked open and a woman stepped out, mid-30s, maybe a frazzled ponytail, one flip-flop slightly torn a child's car seat visible in the back. She wore oversized sunglasses and moved with that kind of cautious energy that came from too many decisions made under duress. Joanna nodded with a smile. Morning. The woman looked at the stand, at the simple wooden sign, at the basket of fresh warm rolls nestled in wax paper. She squinted. This? You sell these? Suggested donation, but mostly you hungry you eat. The woman hesitated, then reached out and picked up a small whole wheat muffin, its top cracked just enough to show a hint of melted brown sugar. She took one bite, stopped, closed her eyes. For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly tears began to fall behind her sunglasses. She put her hand to her mouth like she could stop it, but the sob escaped anyway, small, sharp, uninvited. Joanna didn't flinch. The woman whispered, her voice raw. First time since the divorce. I feel like someone touched me without needing anything back. Joanna gently nodded, her own throat tightening. Bread's funny that way. The woman pulled off her sunglasses and wiped her eyes. I'm Gwen. Joanna. Gwen looked down at the second muffin in the basket. Can I take one for my daughter? Take two. They sat together on the step of the stand. Gwen told her story in pieces, like crumbs falling from a broken crust marriage at 21, abuse that started slow and bloomed like rot, an escape plan wrapped in motel receipts and food stamps, a 6-year-old who asked too often, Are we okay, Mama? Joanna listened, not like someone collecting information, but like someone holding space. When Gwen left, she left a $5 bill and a note tucked in the tip jar. You didn't just feed me. You reminded me I still exist. That night, Joanna baked double. She didn't know who might come tomorrow, but someone would. She felt it. The next morning, a boy showed up. He couldn't have been more than 22. Wiry frame hair matted beneath a beanie, a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, and a suspicious twitch in his left eye. He didn't approach the stand right away, circled it like a feral thing, sniffing out the scent of caution and cinnamon. Joanna stayed silent, arranging a tray of lemon cardamom knots under a clean towel. Finally, he walked up and nodded once. These fresh, she smiled, about an hour out of the oven. He picked one up, sniffed it, then bit. Hard. His jaw worked like he hadn't eaten in days. She watched his shoulders drop, the first sign of relief. You're not going to charge me. I didn't ask for anything, did I? He glanced at the sign at the jar. I don't got anything, he said, chewing. Joanna shrugged. Then you'll just owe me your name. He smirked. Alex. You local Alex? Nope. You running? He paused. Kinda. Well, she said you look like someone who could crack eggs without breaking the yolks. That's a rare skill. He narrowed his eyes. You hiring? Not exactly, but my wrists aren't what they used to be. Alex spent that day scrubbing pans and fetching water. He didn't talk much. He didn't ask many questions, but he moved like someone used to surviving, and when he cleaned the windows without being asked, Joanna slid him a peanut butter blondie without comment. The next day he was back, earlier. By the end of the week they had a rhythm. Joanna baked. Alex cleaned. Gwen returned every 2 days sometimes with her daughter, who insisted on braiding Joanna's gray hair and calling her Granny Jo. One afternoon, a retired Vietnam vet with a glass eye and a love for cranberry scones sat at the stand and played harmonica for an hour straight. Another day, a young couple who had just lost a baby in utero pulled over their car, quiet with grief. Joanna handed them a warm loaf and didn't say a word. The wife cried into the crust. The husband held her hand and said, Thank you for not asking. Butter and Wild was no longer just a roadside stand. It was a breathing thing, a kind of sanctuary that smelled of yeast and butter and redemption. Word began to travel. No signs posted, no online listings. Just whispers passed between gas station clerks, baristas, social workers. People who needed something or had nothing started appearing like birds following the scent of thawed earth. Joanna made room. She moved a bench beside the stand, brought out a thermos of coffee, built a crate for apples and clementines free for children. Alex added a chalkboard and wrote, You're not broken, you're rising. Every time she thought no one would show, someone did. A teenage girl with blue hair and a tattoo of a sparrow on her collarbone. A man who had just buried his mother and didn't want to go home to silence. A social worker on the verge of quitting. A pregnant waitress with swollen ankles and nowhere to sleep. Joanna fed them all. She fed them with bread, yes. But more than that, with presence. With warmth. With the kind of hospitality that doesn't ask your name first or measure what you've got to offer. One night, Alex stood by the fire behind the cabin holding a chipped mug of tea. He looked at her across the flames. Why are you doing this? Joanna stirred the coals. Doing what? Taking in strays, feeding lost people, letting me sleep in your shed like a damn raccoon. She smirked. You don't bite and you don't steal. That's more than I can say for most. He kicked at the dirt. But seriously, why? She stared into the fire for a long moment, then said, Because I remember what it felt like to be invisible. Alex didn't reply. He just sat down beside her. Butter and Wild kept growing. Someone donated a folding table. Someone else dropped off a box of mason jars and a bag of lavender. One afternoon, a woman left behind a bag of fresh rosemary and a note, "For the hands that remind me to stay soft." Joanna pinned the note to the side of the stand. She began collecting them, stories and scribbles, gratitude in torn napkins. The wall of the cabin grew full, and through it all the bread kept coming. It was never perfect. The loaves were sometimes lumpy, the muffins occasionally flat, the shortbread cracked at the edges. But no one complained, because people didn't come here for perfection. They came to remember how to breathe. They came to feel full, not just in their stomachs, but in that hollow part of the chest where disappointment tends to live. And Joanna, she didn't say much, didn't preach, didn't overshare. But every time someone sat beside her, she listened, with her eyes, with her body, with her hands kneading dough in a bowl while pain spilled into the air like flour. By the end of that week, Butter and Wild wasn't a secret anymore. It was a hush in the town's bones. A place you didn't talk too loudly about in case it disappeared. A refuge. A soft place to land. And behind the flour-dusted counters beside the trays of warm rolls stood a gray-haired woman with a crooked smile and a heart that had somehow impossibly survived. Joanna had not just returned. She had become a lighthouse. It started with the wind lifting off the ridge, soft but sure, carrying the scent of rosemary wood smoke and something new. Joanna stood barefoot outside the cabin one morning, mug of coffee warming her fingers. The frost had lifted from the grass, and sunlight stretched itself like a lazy cat over the slope. The roof still leaked. The makeshift counter on the stand was crooked. The back door dragged on its hinges. But the air smelled of promise, and for the first time in a long while, Joanna felt like she could breathe without flinching. Behind her, Gwen was crouched, hammering a loose board back into the porch steps. She wasn't dressed like a visitor anymore. Jeans rolled at the ankles, hands, calloused hair tied with a rubber band she found in the glove box. She moved like a woman who'd stopped waiting to be rescued. "You sure this board's not going to split?" Gwen asked, squinting at the grain. Joanna stepped beside her and examined it. "If it does, we'll patch it again. Everything here's a little cracked. Doesn't mean it won't hold." From the side of the cabin came a loud clang and a muffled curse. "Alex." "Stupid rusted gutter," he shouted, "just bit me." Joanna chuckled. "Maybe it's just hungry for attention." Alex came around the corner holding a dented piece of aluminum. A smear of blood trailed down his forearm, but he looked more annoyed than hurt. "You got any rubbing alcohol?" "In the green tin, bottom shelf." He nodded and ducked inside. The three of them had become a strange trio, a widow, a runaway, and a single mom. But somehow, between loaves and nails and shared silences, they'd formed something steadier than charity or rhythm. Butter and Wild, once a single table with 6 rolls and a chalkboard, had grown. Gwen had found an old screen door at a thrift store and painted it robin's egg blue. Alex built shelves from reclaimed wood he pulled from a half-collapsed barn a mile down the road. Someone donated a tablecloth with lemons on it. Someone else dropped off 2 jars of homemade apple butter. Now the stand had 2 tables, 1 bench, a string of solar-powered lights, and a map with pins where people came from. Red pins for those who'd returned twice. Blue for those who'd brought someone with them. Joanna looked at the growing constellation of pins and felt something tug in her chest. Hope, maybe. Every Saturday she started a class. It wasn't formal, no sign-ups, no tuition, no certificates. Just a handwritten note on the stand. Saturday mornings, bread for beginners, 9 a.m. Bring your hands and your hunger. The first week, 2 people came. Gwen brought her daughter. Alex hung around to observe, but ended up shaping rolls better than anyone else. By the 3rd Saturday, they had a crowd. A recently divorced truck driver with a soft spot for molasses. A nurse on burnout leave. A retired librarian who confessed she'd never made anything from scratch except toast. They stood shoulder to shoulder at makeshift counters, aprons streaked with flour, laughing, crying, pausing. When Joanna stopped to explain the importance of letting dough rest, how rise came from patience, not pressure. Dough is like people, she told them once. It needs time, a warm place, a little air. If you force it, it collapses. Someone whispered same. By noon, they'd have warm loaves lined along the window ledge, a kind of edible mosaic, imperfect, hearty, alive. And the word spread, not through billboards or flyers, but mouths and memories. One afternoon, a silver Toyota sedan pulled into the turnout, and a man in corduroy stepped out, camera around his neck, notepad in hand. He introduced himself as Jonah from the Haven Hill Gazette. "I've been hearing about this place from just about everyone in town. Thought I'd come see for myself." Joanna dusted flour off her apron and handed him a warm cranberry scone. "We don't advertise, but word travels." Jonah took a bite, eyes widening. "Jesus." Close, she smiled. "Just butter and brown sugar." He walked around the stand, asked questions, took pictures of the chalkboard, the bread baskets, the jar of notes, people left behind, tiny confessions, small thank yous. One folded poem that read, "My daughter spoke today. She said, 'This bread tastes like you still love me.'" Jonah wrote in silence for a while after reading that. The article ran a week later. "A hilltop bakery brings spring to Haven Hill." The piece described the smell of the bread, the warmth of the people, and the strange peace that seemed to hang over the slope where Butter and Wild stood. It wasn't just about food, he wrote. It was about reclamation, about how a woman who had lost everything somehow built something that made others feel found. The piece went semi-viral, at least by small-town standards. It got shared on local Facebook groups, pinned to the library's bulletin board, read aloud during the town council's coffee hour. People who hadn't visited the mountain road in years began to drive up on weekends, some out of curiosity, others holding something tender and unnamed in their chests. A florist from Main Street brought marigolds in jam jars. A retired mechanic donated a small propane heater for the cold mornings. A shy teenager from the high school gifted Joanna a batch of hand-drawn business cards that simply said, "Butter and Wild, come hungry, leave whole." And still Joanna woke early every morning to knead. She didn't let the attention change the work. She measured by feel. She baked with her hands. She read every note, remembered every face, and kept the fire in the cabin going even when the nights dipped below freezing. One Sunday afternoon, Gwen stood beside her at the stand, watching the sun stretch its gold across the mountaintop. "I used to think I'd never belong anywhere again," Gwen said quietly. Joanna glanced over. Gwen smiled. "But here I do. We all do. Even Alex, though he'd rather choke on a baguette than admit it." They both laughed. Alex, sitting nearby on a folding crate, lifted a middle finger without looking up from the batch of rolls he was glazing. That evening, after the last car pulled away, after the last mug was rinsed, Joanna stepped back and looked at the small kingdom she hadn't meant to build. The stand, the shelf of jams, the board covered in pins, the people who stayed long after the bread was gone. She thought about Paul, how he used to believe in sanctuaries and wilderness, in places where people could disappear and come back new. She wondered if this is what he'd meant, not hiding, but healing. The stars came out slowly, one by one. A breeze carried the scent of the last rosemary loaf cooling on the window ledge. Joanna wrapped her arms around herself and closed her eyes. She wasn't anyone's charity case. Not anymore. She was the woman who had been cast out and built a table instead of a wall. And now the whole town was pulling up chairs. Joanna was ladling tomato soup into chipped ceramic mugs when she heard the sound of gravel crunching outside. It wasn't the usual shuffle of hikers or the careful hum of weekend wanderers looking for bread. This was slower, heavier. A car engine coughed once, sputtered, then went silent. She froze mid-motion, the ladle dripping red back into the pot. Outside the window, a figure emerged from an aging sedan. She didn't recognize him at first. The beard was new, unkempt, wiry, flecked with gray. His coat was wrinkled, his pants creased in all the wrong places, and his shoes looked like they'd been walked into the ground. The way he moved, shoulders low, arms slack, reminded her of someone who had come to confess something, not ask for anything. Then he looked up, and it was Daniel, her son, her only son. He stood at the edge of the property, hands shoved into his coat pockets, eyes scanning the setup, like a man peering into someone else's life, unfamiliar, unwelcome, and not quite ready to step in. Joanna didn't move. Behind her, Alex scraped batter from a mixing bowl. "You okay?" She didn't answer. "Joanna." She set the ladle down slowly. "Watch the pot," she said, voice thin. She stepped outside. The breeze was cool and damp, carrying the scent of rosemary bread and burnt pine. Daniel took a tentative step forward, eyes sunken, lips dry. "Hi," he said. Joanna said nothing. He looked at the stand at the chalkboard with Gwen's neat handwriting, the basket of loaves, the bench his mother had sanded by hand. So, this is it. She nodded. He laughed, but it was hollow. Butter and wild. Should have known you'd land on your feet. Joanna folded her arms. Daniel shifted, rocking slightly on his heels. You look different. You look tired? I am. They stood there, the silence between them louder than any accusation. I lost my job, he said finally, eyes on the dirt. 3 months ago. Downsizing, restructuring, whatever they're calling it now. Joanna said nothing. Marla's gone. Took the kids. Said she needed something more stable. I guess I don't blame her. He swallowed. We had debt. The house was under both names, but she kept it. I'm living out of that. He nodded toward the battered sedan. Another pause, then softer. I've got nothing, Mom. Still she didn't speak. Daniel's voice cracked. I thought about going to a shelter. I even parked behind one 2 nights ago. But I couldn't get out of the car. I just sat there like a goddamn statue. And then I thought about you. Joanna's eyes didn't soften. I know what I did. I know what we did. I was greedy, stupid, cruel. And I don't deserve anything from you. His voice trembled. But I don't have anywhere else. I'm not asking for money. Just a place to sleep. I'll stay out of the way. I'll chop wood or clean, or hell, I'll leave in the morning if you want. But I didn't know where else to go. Joanna studied his face. This wasn't the polished man in collared shirts who once sat across from her at her own kitchen table and told her she was no longer independent. This wasn't the voice that whispered about transferring her to a facility like she was a burden. This was someone hollowed out. She turned slowly and walked back inside without a word. Daniel stood there frozen. Then he heard the soft clink of ceramic. Joanna returned a moment later with a chipped blue plate on it, a single thick slice of yesterday's rye bread. Not toasted. No butter. No herbs. Dry, dense, plain. She handed it to him. Daniel stared down at the bread, then up at her. You're not going to say anything. She looked him in the eyes. The same brown eyes he'd had as a boy when he once cried over a dropped cookie, and she'd knelt beside him with a warm smile and open arms. But there was no smile now, just a quiet, tired wariness. I'm watching, she said, that's all. Daniel nodded and chewed. Inside the cabin, the mood shifted like someone had opened a window in winter. Alex kept his head down, rinsing mixing bowls without comment. Gwen arrived 10 minutes later with her daughter and froze in the doorway when she saw Daniel sitting on a stool chewing slowly. Her eyes flicked to Joanna. What the hell is he doing here? Joanna shook her head once. Let him sit. That's all he's done. He doesn't deserve to sit, Gwen snapped. Joanna turned to her. Maybe not, but he's here. And we're not like the rest of the world up here, remember? Gwen clenched her jaw but said nothing more. Daniel sat with the kind of posture that knew it wasn't welcome. His fingers clutched the ceramic mug like a lifeline, and every time someone looked his way, his gaze dropped. He slept in the woodshed that night. Joanna gave him a blanket and a bottle of water. Nothing more. No words. No forgiveness. Just space. He didn't ask for more. The next morning before dawn, Joanna stepped out to check the firewood and found him already chopping sweat on his brow, eyes determined. I couldn't sleep, he said. I didn't ask. I thought I'd do something. Then do it right, she replied, pointing to the crooked stack he'd made. He nodded and got back to work. Over the next 2 days, he didn't talk much. He swept the porch, repaired the hinge on the back door, washed dishes without being asked. Joanna watched. That was all she did. She didn't smile, didn't soften, didn't sit beside him or ask about his health. But she didn't send him away either. Alex didn't speak to him but made sure to bang pots extra loud whenever Daniel was near. Gwen refused to share a table with him, eating outside with her daughter instead. Joanna noticed it all and said nothing. On the 3rd day, Daniel walked up the hill to the stand, looked at the sign, and exhaled. He ran his fingers over the letters. You really made this out of nothing, he whispered. Joanna stepped beside him. Not nothing, she said quietly, just pieces no one wanted anymore. He turned to her. I'm sorry. She looked out at the horizon, the mist rolling low over the pine trees. Don't say it, she said. Not yet. He nodded. Can I stay a little longer? She didn't answer right away. Then we'll see. That night she served dinner stew and cornmeal rolls. She placed a single piece of bread on Daniel's plate. He looked at her and she finally met his gaze. Still no warmth, but no rage either. Just something in between, a space where forgiveness hadn't landed, but possibility had at least stepped into the doorway. And that for now was enough. The day started with the scent of orange peel and ended with the sound of breaking glass. It had been a quiet Wednesday, too quiet. Joanna had risen before the sun as always. She worked the dough with practiced hands, dusted the tops of the lemon poppy seed buns, and let the scent of baking fill the air like it always did, like incense, like memory. Alex had been uncharacteristically quiet, scrubbing baking trays with aggressive circles, his brows low and his jaw tight. Daniel sat by the back window peeling potatoes with a dull paring knife, his eyes flicking up every now and then, as if trying to read the temperature in the room. Gwen didn't come that morning. When Joanna asked Alex where she was, he muttered something about a bad feeling and slammed another tray onto the drying rack. "Say what you're thinking," Joanna said gently. Alex straightened his eyes hard. "You already know what I'm thinking." Joanna waited. He's here a week and someone steals a full basket of bread and leaves behind a smashed jar of donations. Joanna didn't blink. That was last Friday. And now Gwen's missing class, and I found the back door unlatched. Twice. Locks loosen with rain, and trust loosens when people get burned. Daniel said nothing, kept peeling. Alex looked at him, then back at Joanna. He shouldn't be here. Joanna wiped her hands on her apron steady. "That's not your decision." "Maybe not," Alex muttered. "But don't act like you don't feel it too. Something's off." The rest of the day passed in fragments, dough rising flour floating wind, tapping the windows like a second heartbeat. By dusk, a strange stillness had settled over the cabin. Even the trees stood too still. That night the break-in came. Joanna was asleep when she heard it, a sharp, echoing crack, followed by the shatter of glass. She sat up, heart pounding. Outside the wind had picked up, but this wasn't storm damage. This was deliberate, precise. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, slipped out the cabin door barefoot and cold. The bakery stand, her butter and wild, stood in the dark, half collapsed. The front glass jar was shattered, shards scattered across the gravel. The bread baskets were overturned. The chalkboard splintered, its message wiped clean. The shelf of preserves gone. But it was the door to the rear storage that chilled her blood. It had been pried open. Inside the small lockbox that held her handwritten recipes, her legacy was open, its contents flung across the floor, cards trampled, one burned at the edges. She dropped to her knees. Hands trembling, she gathered the scattered papers. Her handwriting stared back at her in panic. Scribbled lines for the cranberry pecan loaf, the sourdough starter she'd cultivated for 15 years. Each card was a story, a breath, a part of her that had survived Daniel's betrayal, Paul's death, and the crushing silence of grief. Now thrown like trash. Joanna blinked hard, her hands tightening. Behind her, a flashlight beam cut through the dark. It was Daniel. He stood there, coat half-zipped, breathing hard. "What happened?" She didn't answer. He looked past her, took in the damage. His face paled. "Was anyone hurt?" Still she said nothing. He stepped closer. "Mom." And in that moment she turned slow, deliberate, and looked him straight in the eyes. Daniel froze. "You think I did this?" he asked, stunned. She didn't speak, but she didn't deny it either. He took a step back. "Jesus, you really do." Joanna stood, her breath shallow. "Where were you?" "I was sleeping. In the shed." "All night?" "Yes." "Did you hear anything?" "No, I was out cold. I've been splitting wood for 2 days." "You didn't see anyone?" "No flashlight, no movement. Nothing." His voice cracked. "Mom, I swear. You didn't come out until after you heard me. I was groggy. I thought it was wind." She stared at him, searching for the boy she used to know. The one who used to cling to her hand in grocery stores and draw her birthday cards with macaroni glued to them. But all she saw was a man she didn't recognize, a man with a trail of broken things behind him. Daniel dropped to his knees beside the recipes, picked one up with shaking hands. "This is your cherry almond shortbread," he whispered. "You used to make this every Christmas. I loved it." She pulled it gently from his fingers. "I didn't do this," he said again, almost pleading. "Mom, please. You have to believe me." Joanna looked at him, long and hard, then turned away. The next morning she called the sheriff. They came quietly, 2 officers in windbreakers, polite but curious. They took photos, asked if anything of major value had been stolen. "Only memories," Joanna replied. They made notes. took Daniel's name. He handed it over without protest, his voice, even his hands steady. But his eyes betrayed him, red-rimmed, exhausted, bruised by disbelief. They didn't arrest him, didn't find any prints, no clear motive. But suspicion lingered like smoke. Gwen didn't return that day. Alex refused to speak to Daniel at all. The kitchen was quiet, so quiet the sound of dough cracking under pressure felt like thunder. Joanna worked in silence. Daniel tried to help, tried to sweep, tried to offer to rebuild the glass case. But every movement was met with Gwen's narrowed eyes, Alex's biting silence, and Joanna's wordless nods that didn't feel like acceptance. He stopped trying by midday. Instead, he sat outside on a stump, head bowed, hands idle. Later, Joanna saw him pacing the edge of the woods, talking to himself. She couldn't hear what he said, but the way his shoulders slumped after made something tug behind her ribs. That night, after the others were asleep, Joanna sat in the dark by the fire, recipe cards spread around her like fallen leaves. Some were smudged, some singed, some beyond repair. She picked up the one with Paul's handwriting. His voice came back to her like smoke rising through memory. If you ever forget who you are, Bake, your hands remember even when your heart doesn't. She looked toward the window, toward the blackness where Daniel had once stood. And for the first time in weeks, she felt fear return. Not of violence, not of loss, but of the quiet possibility that her son was capable of breaking what she had just begun to rebuild. The following days were colder. She watched Daniel carefully. Not obvious, not rude, but measured. She noted what time he left the shed, noted what he touched in the kitchen, noted how he flinched when Alex slammed cabinets, how he lingered too long near the new recipe drawer, how his eyes sometimes drifted to the cash jar even when no one was looking. She said nothing, just watched, until she found herself writing a new recipe not on the card, but in the air between them. Ingredients: 1 heavy silence, 2 heaping spoons of doubt, a pinch of guilt, no forgiveness, not yet. Bake at the temperature of unresolved things, and wait to see what rises. It started with a whisper in the woods. Alex had gone out early that morning, pretending to check the trail behind the cabin for fallen branches after the windstorm. But what he was really following was Daniel. He'd seen him 2 nights before, slipping out past dusk, ducking through the tree line with something tucked under his jacket. Alex didn't say anything then. He wanted proof, not suspicions. Suspicion could be dismissed. Proof could not. So this morning, before the dew had even lifted, he followed the man who had shattered whatever fragile trust was left in the air. Daniel walked fast, like someone with a place to be. Not far, just over the ridge to the spot where the road curved around a patch of rock and low pine. It wasn't a place for hiking. It was a place for secrets. Alex crouched behind a thicket and waited. 15 minutes later, a blue sedan pulled up, its tires crunching over gravel. A man stepped out, suit jacket, phone to his ear clipboard under one arm. He wasn't from Haven Hill. That much was clear. Polished shoes, city cologne. The kind of person who only came up here for one reason: to make a deal. Daniel greeted him with a quick handshake. Alex lifted his phone, thumbed the camera app, and clicked the shutter once, twice, 3 times. Then he watched as Daniel pulled a manila envelope from under his coat. The suited man opened it. Inside were papers, diagrams, sketches, what looked like printed versions of Joanna's recipe cards. He flipped through them, slowly nodding. Alex's hands tightened into fists. He took more photos, then slipped away before they could see him, heart pounding like thunder in his chest. That afternoon, Joanna was kneading dough when Alex stormed in. "We need to talk," he said, holding up his phone. She wiped her hands and met him by the window. He showed her the pictures, one by one, silent. With each swipe, something in her face hardened, her mouth pulled tight, her eyes narrowed, her spine straightened. When he got to the final image, Daniel shaking hands with the suited man, she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. Alex didn't say anything else. He knew she needed space, time. Joanna turned, walked to the cabin, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Daniel returned around dusk, humming softly to himself. He carried a paper bag with groceries, eggs, sugar, flour, as if to cloak his betrayal and generosity. She stood by the door as he entered. He paused when he saw her. "Hey," he said. "I picked up a few things. Thought we could try that old honey loaf again." Joanna didn't move. Instead, she said, "Empty your coat pocket." Daniel blinked. "What?" "Left inside pocket, now." He hesitated, then slowly reached in and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She held out her hand. He didn't move. Daniel. His jaw tightened. He placed the paper in her palm. She unfolded it, read it. The letterhead said Bayloft Foods, Inc. An offer letter. A contract. They were offering to purchase a line of rustic small-batch recipes from a confidential source. A 5-year licensing deal. Mid-6 figures. Scalable across their national cafe chain. They even had a proposed name. Butter and Wild Tim Heritage Line. Joanna stared at the paper, then at her son. Did you give them my recipes? Daniel looked away. Her voice cracked low and shaking. Answer me. They were just samples, he said. Mock-ups, drafts. I didn't sign anything yet. But you plan to. Silence. Joanna folded the paper slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the counter like it was something rotten. You stole from me. I didn't. Stop! Her voice rose, sharp, final. Do not lie to me again. Daniel's shoulders sank. I thought maybe I could finally contribute something, help fix what I ruined, pay off the debts, build something real. You said this place was about second chances. Second chances aren't given to people who are still scheming, she cut in. They're earned. And you've done nothing but circle like a vulture waiting for something to fall apart so you can sell the bones. Daniel's face flushed. I was trying to help. No, she said, eyes blazing now. You were trying to take what you didn't build. Again. He stepped forward. It's not like I sold the entire business. It's just a few recipes. They are not recipes, she snapped. They're pieces of me. Pieces of your father. Of every Christmas, every night I stayed up testing ratios while you were asleep. They're the only thing I carried out of that house after you tried to put me away. Do you understand that I left everything behind and all I had was this box? Daniel said nothing. Joanna took a deep breath. Then quieter. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed yourself. That landed. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I don't know who you are anymore, she said. He took a step back. I didn't sign anything, he said, again weaker this time. I didn't go through with it. But you wanted to. That's enough. His eyes glistened. I was desperate. So was I, she said. You just didn't care. Silence wrapped around them like a storm cloud, thick and charged. Daniel sank onto the bench by the door, burying his face in his hands. Joanna didn't comfort him. She walked to the fireplace, lit the evening fire, and stood staring into the flames, while the paper bag of groceries sat abandoned on the counter, the eggs sweating in their carton, the sugar bleeding slowly into the wood. That night she sat at the table long after everyone else had gone to bed, sorting through her recipe cards with fingers that trembled only slightly. She took the burned one, the cherry cardamom shortbread half scorched at the corner, and slipped it back into the tin without rewriting it. Let the scars stay, she thought. Let them tell the truth. The cabin was quiet save for the soft hiss of the kettle and the distant rustle of wind threading its way through pine branches. Joanna stood by the stove, her back to the table, hands busy with motions that had kept her steady for most of her life, weighing, kneading, shaping. The dough in front of her was familiar, almost sacred flour, water, salt, honey, and the last handful of dried raisins soaked in warm tea. She worked in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths needed the slow permission of bread to rise. Behind her, Daniel sat hunched at the long wooden table, elbows on knees, face hollow. He hadn't moved since the confrontation the day before. He hadn't spoken since she'd laid the contract on the counter like a blade and cut him open with every word he had deserved to hear. Now he just stared at the wall as if trying to remember a version of himself that hadn't yet lost everything. Joanna shaped the loaf with care. She didn't glance at him, didn't ask if he was hungry. She just let the rhythm of baking fill the room, let the scent of cinnamon and yeast press into the air like balm against open wounds. After 20 minutes, she slipped the pan into the wood stove, adjusted the coals, and wiped her hands on her apron. She turned finally and sat across from him. Daniel didn't lift his head. You used to love raisin bread, she said quietly. He nodded, still didn't speak. I'd bake it every Sunday after church. You'd steal the end piece and run to the backyard like it was a game. His lips twitched, almost a smile. Joanna leaned forward slightly. I always let you win. You thought you were so sneaky. Daniel looked up then, and for the first time, really looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion, shame, and something raw, naked. I was never him, he said. Joanna tilted her head. Who? Dad. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into a still pond. I could never be him. Not the way you looked at him. Not the way people talked about him after he died. He was the quiet strength, the steady hand, the good man. I didn't get that gene, Mom. Joanna said nothing. Daniel pressed his fingers into his temples. I've spent my whole life trying to measure up to a man I couldn't compete with. I made money, but it wasn't enough. I got married, had kids, but it all fell apart. And every time I came back here, every time I heard you say, your father used to, I felt smaller. Joanna's brow furrowed, not with anger, but something more wounded. Is that why you hurt me? She asked. Because you were trying to beat a dead man. Daniel's breath hitched. I didn't mean to, he whispered. Not like that. I couldn't face being the one who failed. I thought if I could build something, even if I had to use your recipes, I'd finally prove I was worth something. You wanted worth at the cost of someone else's soul, Joanna said flatly. He nodded slowly. I know. Silence filled the cabin again, thick, reverent. Then Joanna rose, walked to the stove, and opened the door. The aroma hit the room like a hymn, caramelized crust, honeyed raisins, and warmth. She pulled the loaf out, placed it on the counter, and let it rest. After a few minutes, she returned with a small wooden board and a single slice. No butter, no jam, just the bread still steaming its edge, golden and cracked. She set it down in front of Daniel. He stared at it, stunned. She sat again, folded her hands. I baked this before, she said. Years ago. You were 9. You got stung by a wasp at school, remember? He nodded. You came home angry, embarrassed. Said you didn't cry in front of the nurse, but your hands were shaking. I remember. I made this for you. Sat right where you are now, and you said this tastes like home. Daniel's throat bobbed. Joanna leaned closer. I baked it again today, but the ingredients are different. The flour's not the same. The yeast is from a new batch. Even the raisins are older. He looked at her, and you know what she said, voice soft. It tastes different, because nothing ever stays the same. We all change. We all ruin things. But if we're willing to truly admit it, maybe something new can rise. He reached for the bread with shaky hands, took a bite, chewed slowly, swallowed like it hurt. Joanna watched him. You're not the same boy I raised, she said. You're not your father, and you're not the man I hoped you'd become. But maybe you can start becoming someone worth forgiving. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes. He wiped them quickly, then gave up and let them fall. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. For everything. For the house. For the signatures. For leaving you. For using you. For pretending I was better than I am. She nodded once, quietly. I'm not ready to forgive you yet, she said, voice cracking. But I'm listening. Daniel took another bite, crying now, mouth full of warmth and guilt. I don't deserve this. No, she said, but you needed it. They sat there, mother and son, with a loaf of raisin bread between them, and a decade's worth of silence finally broken. When he finished the slice, Daniel stood slowly. Joanna didn't ask him to stay, and he didn't ask if he could. He walked to the cabin door, placed his hand on the knob, then turned back. Thank you, he said, for the bread, for not closing the door. Joanna looked at the fire. Her voice was low. That depends on what you do after you walk through it. Daniel nodded, then stepped outside. The sun was setting. The pines glowed gold at the tips, and the wind had softened to a whisper. Joanna watched him walk to the edge of the clearing toward the road. He didn't look back. She turned to the stove, stoked the fire, dropped a fresh log onto the embers, and watched the sparks rise like fireflies looking for something to land on. And then for the first time in a long time, a single tear fell down her cheek, not from rage or grief or betrayal, but something more complex, something older, like release. She wiped it away with the edge of her sleeve and went back to kneading. The sun rose differently over Haven Hill now, not louder, not brighter, just softer, as if the mountain itself had exhaled. After Daniel left, Joanna didn't speak about him, not to Alex, not to Gwen, not even to herself. She just kept baking. But the silence in her hands was different, no longer a wall, but a kind of soil. Something was growing, something fragile, but alive. Butter and Wild had taken a beating, but it wasn't broken. When word of the break-in spread, and yes, it had spread, though no one said Daniel's name out loud, the town came anyway. In fact, they came more often. They didn't ask what happened. They just showed up, with tools, with nails, with extra flour and donations and paintbrushes. Some brought chairs, some brought their kids, and a few brought just their stories. A retired couple offered to rebuild the back shelving. 2 teenagers from the high school shop class showed up with fresh-cut cedar planks and asked, "Can we help?" Joanna gave them apple cider and a nod. The porch got sanded. The windows got replaced. Someone brought string lights and a chalkboard that said in Gwen's curvy handwriting, "We rise by kneading together." On Saturday mornings, Butter and Wild became something like a school, but not the kind with bells and desks. This one had laughter and flower fights and cinnamon-smudged lesson plans. Kids from the valley would bike up the hill, their helmets dangling from their handlebars, still chewing the last of their cereal bars as they shuffled into the cabin. They learned how to crack eggs with one hand, how to roll dough without tearing it, how to listen for the hollow thump of a loaf that had baked just right. "Cooking's like life," Joanna told them once. "If you're afraid to make a mess, you'll never learn the good stuff." The kids loved her. So did the elderly. A small group of older folks from the local community center began arriving every Thursday just before noon, always with thermoses of tea and conversation that moved like molasses, but warmed the room better than any stove. They didn't come to bake. They came to remember. One woman, 82 years old, told Joanna about losing her brother in Vietnam, and how he once sent her a letter that smelled like banana bread. Another in his 70s spoke about his wife, who passed last year, how she used to sing while making cherry turnovers. He hadn't heard that song in months until he walked past the bakery and smelled sugar and cinnamon, and suddenly heard her voice again. Joanna listened. She didn't offer therapy. She just poured warm cider and passed fresh scones and let the stories rise as they would. It was late September when Daniel returned. The trees were starting to curl into flame-burnt orange, brittle gold, dusky red. The morning air came with breath in it, and Joanna, dusting flour from her apron, turned toward the stand to find him already there. He wasn't holding anything, no bag, no excuses, no sorrow polished into performance. He was just wiping the wooden table, slowly, one corner to the other. Alex saw him first. He stiffened, put down the mixing bowl, but he didn't storm out this time. Instead, he looked at Joanna, waiting. Joanna watched Daniel. He glanced at her once, a nod, barely a twitch of the mouth. Then he bent and picked up the kindling bucket, went to the firewood stack, began restocking the hearth. No words. He moved like someone trying not to break what was already mending. Joanna didn't stop him. That day he said nothing. The next day he returned. Did the same. On the third morning he stood beside her at the counter as she rolled out dough, not speaking, just mimicking. When she slid the tray of braided challah into the oven, she passed him a lump of dough and pointed to the flour. He didn't smile, but he got to work. The other volunteers noticed. No one said much, but slowly the tension loosened its grip. Alex stopped slamming drawers. Gwen stopped freezing when Daniel passed. The children didn't know the backstory. They just liked the man with the tired eyes, who didn't mind when their cookies came out burnt. One afternoon, Gwen pulled Joanna aside. "You think he's changed?" Joanna looked at Daniel across the room, sleeves rolled up, flour on his face, focused on cutting scones with care. "I think," she said, "he's trying to become someone new, not prove he never was the old." Gwen nodded. "That's something, I guess." "That's everything." A week later, Alex packed up a stack of loaf pans and his sourdough starter and said, "I think it's time." For what Joanna asked. "I signed a lease in town, little storefront near the barber shop. Gonna call it The Second Rise." Joanna smiled. "That's a good name." He shrugged. "I learn it from the best." They hugged brief tight. When he pulled back, he added, "Still coming back on Saturdays. Don't think I'm done with the muffins yet." She swatted him with a towel. That same week, Gwen walked in with a rolled yoga mat under one arm and a hand-lettered flyer in the other. "Free trauma-informed yoga at the community center," she said. "First class is Thursday. You're invited. No excuses." Joanna grinned. "Will there be snacks?" "There will now." By mid-October, Butter and Wild no longer looked like a rescue. It looked like a village. People came not just for the bread, but for each other, for the permission to start over, to be messy and soft and honest. and in the center of it always was Joanna, flower on her cheek, apron tied tight, hands that no longer trembled. She moved like a woman who had been broken, then built herself into something stronger, quieter, wiser. A hearth. That afternoon, Daniel sat beside her at the prep table slicing apples for a tart. "You think we'll ever be like before?" he asked. Joanna didn't look up. Before was a lie we were both telling. He nodded. "I'd like to tell a better one this time." She passed him a bowl of cinnamon sugar. "Then start by not skipping the seasoning." They baked in silence. Outside the wind picked up, but the windows held. The fire crackled, and something in the air and the bread and the breath between words smelled like forgiveness. It was raining, not the kind that made people run for cover, but the kind that made the trees sway gently, the soil breathe deeper, and the air carry the scent of everything alive. Joanna stood in front of the open oven, a folded linen towel in one hand, the other gripping the wooden handle of the tray. The heat flushed her cheeks, and the buttery scent of fresh spring brioche rose around her like memory. Outside the cabin, the mist clung low to the earth, veiling the mountaintop in soft gray silk. It was spring, and this time it had come to stay. The cabin crackled with warmth. The lights strung along the rafters twinkled with beads of rain. On the far wall, the recipe cards fluttered slightly in the draft from the open window like quiet applause from the past. Gwen had just left after her Saturday yoga class. Alex was due later with a crate of jam for trade. Daniel was somewhere nearby, maybe stacking kindling or watching the loaves rise through the oven window like prayers. But for now it was just Joanna, and the bread, and the rain. She placed the golden loaves onto the counter and wiped a bit of steam from her glasses. The smell was almost too much to bear. Warm citrus honey, the subtlest note of cardamom. She leaned on the edge of the butcher's table and closed her eyes. This was the first spring in years. She wasn't surviving. She was living. A knock at the cabin door pulled her back. When she opened it, she saw 5 children soaking wet, their coats clinging to their arms, shoes muddy. Behind them stood a young woman in her 20s, eyes kind but tired, her clipboard shielded from the rain by a laminated map. "Sorry to show up unannounced," the woman said, her voice soft. "I'm Kira, from Pine Ridge Youth Services." Joanna stepped aside. "Come in before you catch your death." The kids filed in, 2 boys, 3 girls, all between 8 and 12. Their eyes darted everywhere, hungry and curious like wild animals waiting for someone to tell them it was safe to breathe. Kira followed them inside. "We're on a field program taking the kids to local community spaces for enrichment days. We were supposed to visit the dairy farm down the hill, but they closed early due to flooding. One of the volunteers mentioned Butter and Wild. I wasn't sure you'd be open." Joanna nodded toward the bread. "We're always open when the oven's warm." The smallest girl, no older than 7, pointed at the trays. "Did you make those?" Joanna smiled, with a little help from the weather. The girl giggled. "Would you like a piece?" They all nodded at once. Joanna grabbed a serrated knife, sliced generous portions, and placed them on wooden plates, then poured cider from the warm thermos by the hearth. She didn't ask for payment, didn't mention donations. She simply laid the food out on the long table and said, "Sit, eat, rest your feet." The children didn't wait for permission. Within seconds, the sound of soft chewing filled the space. A boy with freckles closed his eyes after the first bite. Another, lanky and cautious, looked around like he wasn't sure this wasn't a trick. Joanna knelt beside him. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just warm." Those 2 words stayed with her. She glanced at Kira, who had stepped back toward the door, visibly moved. "Thank you," Kira whispered. "They don't get this often." Joanna placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "There's always a place at my table, especially for those still learning what home feels like." One of the older girls raised her hand, crumbs on her lip. "Are you like a grandma?" Joanna laughed. "Something like that." The girl nodded. "You smell like one." From behind, Daniel appeared in the doorway, rain in his hair boots, muddy arms filled with firewood. He paused when he saw the visitors, then gave a small nod and walked quietly to the hearth, restocking the wood. One of the boys watched him, then followed to help. Joanna watched her son and the child work side by side in silence. Kira wiped her eye. "How long have you been doing this?" Joanna took a deep breath. "Since I had nothing left to offer except bread and a stove that still worked." Kira looked around the cabin. "It's healing in here." That's the yeast, Joanna smiled. It knows more about resurrection than most preachers. The laughter was light, not loud, not forced, but real. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper. Inside, the children began humming a song someone must have taught them at the center. It wasn't in harmony, but it was honest. Joanna stepped outside, apron still tied, and stood beneath the tin roof of the porch. The scent of brioche still clung to her skin. The rain dotted her sleeves and dampened her hair. She watched the trees sway, the clouds break apart into threads of light. Daniel joined her, said nothing. They stood together for a long time. After a while she said, "They'll remember this bread." "I know," he said. "They'll remember the warmth and the fact that someone made room for them." Daniel nodded, "Just like you did for me." She didn't respond, but her hand brushed lightly against his. Inside, the cabin glowed like a lantern on the hill. The camera would pull back now if this were a film. It would show Joanna older but stronger, standing in her rain-kissed apron, her son beside her, the fire inside flickering with life. The windows lit with the faces of children, the walls lined with cards and stories, the oven still full, and behind them the mountain, tall, still, watching over it all. Butter and Wild had never been about the bread. It was about the people who found their way here when the world told them they were too broken to rise. It was about second chances, about starting over with flour on your hands and smoke in your eyes, and forgiveness somewhere beneath the crust. As the rain faded and the sun cracked through, Joanna closed her eyes, and for the first time in years she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. Not to Daniel, not to the town, not even to herself. She was here, still rising, still warm, still needed. And spring in all its quiet glory had finally come home to Haven Hill.